Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have one of my best friends in compliance and the whistleblower world, Mary Inman, partner at Whistleblower Partners LLP. Mary, first of all, welcome back.
Thank you so much, Tom. Always great to be back.
Mary, we had a pretty big announcement from the Department of Justice last week, and they finally rolled out the Department of Justice Whistleblower Incentive Program. I know you've had of time to think about this, and perhaps you and your partners are already talking about strategies going forward. But I wanted to maybe see if we could start with what you see as the basics of the program.
Yeah, so the basics of the program are that the DOJ is trying to fill gaps that have been left by the existing whistleblower reward program. So, what I like to say is that the DOJ is playing a game of catch up. They're probably having a lot of envy about these other programs like the SEC, CFTC, FinCEN, Treasury Department, False Claims Act sections, where whistleblowers have been leveraged to great effect, allowing sort of the enforcement arm to basically supercharge their efforts. So that's what it's coming from. What I thought was really interesting is that, do you want me to, we ready? Okay. What I thought was really interesting, Tom, is that Lisa Monaco, the Deputy Attorney General, rolling this out last week, said that the current programs, whistleblower reward programs that the SEC, CFTC, Treasury, FinCEN, and the False Claims Act create, which she said is a patchwork quilt that doesn't cover the whole bed. So what she's trying to do here is to cover the whole bed. The program exists not to duplicate the efforts of these other programs, but to fill in the gaps. So one of the primary areas where there's a gap is in the area of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which I know is a big area for you and your listeners. And under the SEC program, the SEC only has jurisdiction to enforce FCPA violations if the violator is a publicly traded company. That up until this new program, the DOJ's program, that left a lot of whistleblowers who had some very valuable information about Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violations without a potential bounty program, reward program to incentivize them to step forward. So that's one of the gaps that the program seeks to fill. But it really has four discrete areas, four focus areas. So the first one is violations by financial institutions, and that includes schemes involving money laundering. If you don't have an adequate AML compliance program, if you haven't registered as a money transmitting business, and other fraud statutes, and even frauds against um, financial institution regulators. For instance, the New York Department of Financial Services. If you're defrauding them, that seems like something DOJ now wants whistleblowers to help them with. The second area is, as I mentioned, foreign corruption and bribery. It's not just the FCPA. They also specifically mentioned FIPA, the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act, which criminalizes the demand side of foreign bribery claims. That's another area related to that. Their third area is not foreign bribery, but domestic. They're looking, and that's a new area for them. I would say the first two areas have been in the heartland of what DOJ criminal has been doing enforcement wise. But the second two areas of the four subject areas, including focus on domestic corruption like briberies and kickbacks paid to domestic public officials, that's sort of a new priority area, which is exciting to see. And last but not least, and I think most significant, honestly, is the role of them wanting to get whistleblowers to help them go after federal healthcare offenses. The False Claims Act, as we know, already does a great job of incentivizing whistleblowers to bring information when it is the Medicare and Medicaid and TRICARE programs, the federally funded health insurance programs that are being cheated. But that left a huge gap if you had information as a whistleblower about private health insurers. And so in this, which is a little lesser known and what's been discussed publicly about the program, is that the state of California and the state of Illinois both have whistleblower reward programs under their departments of insurance that seek to and have successfully paid tens of millions of dollars to whistleblowers if the whistleblowers had information that the parties defrauded were private insurers. The reason for that, of course, and the reason the insurance divisions of these states cares about that is that we all suffer in terms of the rates that we need to pay and for insurance are elevated whenever there's fraud. So that's part of what they seek to get at here. They're also looking for healthcare fraud when the victims are not the federally funded programs, but instead are patients, investors, or non governmental entities. And then they have a catch all that says basically any federal violation involving conduct that related to healthcare that is not covered by the False Claims Act. Again, trying to put that quilt together and saying there's some holes and the False Claims Act helps us with healthcare fraud up to a point. We want to close those gaps. So it's really rather remarkable. And I think the most ingenious thing is, or the most notable thing to me is for all the other programs we just talked about, the SEC, CFTC, FinCEN, False Claims Act, those all came about as a result of consciously chosen congressional policies and statutes where they created these programs. They said, we specifically want to create an Office of the Whistleblower. Here, the reason this is limited, the whistleblowers are limited to getting information about getting rewards limited to forfeitures is that they took an existing statute that they have that allows them to pay DOJ criminal to pay corporate informant, and they just blew that program and expanded it outward. So I think that's really unique, right? Is they took the initiative to create a whistleblower program based on existing authority. They didn't have to go to Congress to ask for it.
I'd like to focus on, as you noted, FCPA, but also FIPA or FEPA, and ask you, do you think this initiative may help bring information from overseas whistleblowers to the attention of the Department of Justice? I know something you have worked on in your professional career.
Yeah, I think that for me, this is such welcome news because when I was head of our international practice and worked in London recruiting whistleblowers to the US programs, the largest source of whistleblowers that we had from overseas was people, obviously, with information about bribery of foreign government entities, because by definition, that's happening outside the United States. So I think this sends a really strong signal. We turned away a lot of people who fell in that gap, who had really strong information about bribery of government officials, but because of the vagaries of the SEC's jurisdiction, they weren't publicly listed. So I think we're going to see a huge increase in this area of more whistleblowers being willing to step forward to report here. There is a caveat, and I don't know, Tom, if now we want to get into this, which is that there are a few, I would say, negatives. I would say we have a few criticisms about the program that I think will make it not as successful as, for instance, like the other SEC, CFTC, FinCEN programs that are really holes that we think need to be filled before we think that the whistleblowers really will be coming in droves. And one of those issues is a fact that in the reward mechanism, there is no floor. So it's in the sole discretion of DOJ criminal, which it's actually going to be their MLARS unit, their money laundering and asset recovery unit. It's going to be in charge of determining rewards to whistleblowers. And if there is no minimum, all the other programs I mentioned, it's usually 10 to 30% you're allowed. So there's always a floor. So you know that if you bring in qualifying information at a minimum, you'll get 10%. And here, there's no floor. So it could be zero. And I think we all know whistleblowers hate uncertainty, right? It's solely in DOJ's discretion and whistleblowers put a lot on the line. That is something that will deter them from coming forward because they're saying, why do I bring all this if there's a chance they may give me nothing? So the first thing we would say is they need a floor. They need the 10% floor. And that is actually something we were successful in persuading FinCEN to do because their program started out similarly for 0 to 30, and then they amended it probably 6 months after the program came in. So I don't know why they made this faux pas because it's a huge faux pas. And it's one that I think is rather surprising to us, given that we know DOJ consulted the heads of the whistleblower offices at all of those agencies.
All right, let me use that to maybe explore a topic that concerns me a little bit, which is that without a floor, and I want to throw in above 500 million as well, does this leave a whistleblower reward to the whims of an administration or a specific head of the attorney general or even down to the policymakers. And I want to further bring in what Jay Clayton tried to do at the Securities and Exchange Commission, which was cut back on payments of whistleblower awards. Are we looking at something like that potentially again?
Yeah, we are, and I think I'm really glad you raised that because those are the 2 real foibles, Achilles heels of this program is 1, there's no floor, and 2, there's a cap. What you're alluding to is the fact that the way the award structure works is whistleblowers are entitled to receive up to 30% of the first $100 million. Then after that, they get 5% of the next 100 to $500 million if the amount of the forfeiture exceeds $500 million, you're not entitled to anything. That's what we mean by a cap. We've never before in the United States ever seen a whistleblower program introduce a cap. The SEC, as you were alluding to, Clayton introduced it, and there was a very large public outcry. And we were part of some of the thought leaders who were providing input to the SEC on this. And our strongest argument, which remains our argument today, is why are you penalizing people bringing the largest frauds, right? It seems to come from a visceral place, like how much money is too much money for a whistleblower. I think that's where it comes from, but there's no principle behind that. And I think the problem is that we think about one of the largest rewards ever paid to a whistleblower was the CFTC program was for the LIBOR manipulation fraud. That person obviously exposed themselves greatly in an enormous industry. And I think if you're going to put caps on those sorts of things, that you're really deterring people, precisely the people that you want to bring the most, is the people who are bringing the largest information about the largest frauds in the world are the ones who have the most to lose. So why are we only paying them 5%, which is below the floor of all the other 10% programs? And then why are we saying we're not going to even pay you anything if it exceeds $500 million? That just seems to me to be just wrongheaded in terms of how do we want to incentivize whistleblowers, particularly in fact, some of the most impactful whistleblowers.
Mary, I'd like to turn to another area of, I want to say ambiguity, but at least one that I have concerns around. And that is the interplay between the whistleblowing to the Department of Justice, a corporation having an opportunity to, within 120 days after that initial report, investigate and self disclose to the Department of Justice, and then sort of the quality of information that a whistleblower might bring, as opposed to a company who, with 120 days, has actually done an investigation and may have more information. So clearly, the DOJ wants whistleblowers to whistleblow internally to give a company the opportunity to fix it. At least it's clear to me that's one goal. But I think the figures are somewhere between 85 and 90% of current whistleblowers whistleblow internally first. So there's a robust culture of people trying to do the right thing internally. And either out of frustration or other reasons, they didn't turn to go to the SEC or one of the other agencies you've noted. Well, here we really have that enshrined. But after there's a disclosure to the Department of Justice, if a company has been made aware of by the internal whistleblowing, then they have 120 days. So could we maybe explore that? And do you see that as a potential ambiguity, a problem, or am I way off base?
I don't see it as a problem, actually, and let me explain why. I actually think it's a great device that they've included, which is really creating what they describe a race to the courthouse, a race to DOJ. Is what they're trying to create. So they say, who comes first? We're not. What if a whistleblower comes first? If then subsequently the company comes, we're still going to reward or incentivize both of you. So if a whistleblower reports and then the company gets to DOJ before the whistleblower does, the whistleblower still has 120 days to file with DOJ to qualify for a reward. So they're really trying to create the space. And then conversely, if a whistleblower reports to DOJ after having reported internally. So long as the company reports within 120 days to DOJ, then they're going to get that credit saying that we're not going to, a declination credit under the voluntary self disclosure programs. I actually think it's kind of clever. Nobody's really harmed by it. And I don't think there's ambiguity. I think the ambiguity will come up. And I think this is what you're anticipating is this all sounds great. Everybody has 120 days, whether you're the whistleblower to get to DOJ, whether you're the whistleblower or whether you're the company, depending on where you are on the starting blocks. But the ambiguity comes in is what if DOJ comes to you before then? So it's not really 120 days. It might be shorter than that if DOJ, for instance, comes to a company and subpoenas them before that 120 days. I think it's unlikely. It usually takes the DOJ a while to get to that kind of place, but there's always a possibility. So what I really love is it really does say to companies, they have to change their posture. And what I've observed over my 30 years is companies often just sit on and frequently ignore whistleblower reports. And you really do that at your peril now, much more. I mean, I think this is really encouraging companies to come forward before DOJ comes knocking.
Mary, any concerns about the difference in information a whistleblower might have personal knowledge of and report to the DOJ as opposed to what a company might be able to develop if they actually do an investigation and self disclose? Because I thought I saw that. Well, any concern about that at this point?
Not really. I mean, I think the whistleblower, they I think they each have I mean, the whistleblowers at more of a disadvantage, honestly, than the company because they don't have full visibility, right? They unless they're a super highly placed whistleblower who's up in the C-suite, a whistleblower is gonna have just their piece of the puzzle based on their vantage point. I mean, obviously, a company, when doing an internal investigation, is gonna have a lot more in the way of resources and will be able to hopefully bring forward a lot more information. So I think it's not necessarily an even playing field, but the way DOJ is constructed is that they're not going to disadvantage either one as long as you get to the DOJ within that 120-day time frame.
Mary, another open question for me, or perhaps ambiguousness, is around the terms under which a whistleblower would be paid. And the language I saw was some percentage up to the cap of forfeiture. Under the corporate enforcement policy, to one of the four requirements for full declination, well, the four are self disclosure, extensive remediation, extensive cooperation. And the fourth is profit disgorgement. And I'm concerned because they're different words, so perhaps they have different meanings. Do you have those same concerns, or do you think profit disgorgement will fall under the term forfeiture that we've seen from the Department of Justice?
I'm hoping it will, but the program you've identified another real limitation to the program, which stems from the statute that DOJ is relying on to create the program, which is that to be eligible, and they make it clear, a whistleblower has to be bringing information that results in a criminal or civil forfeiture. And so will DOJ or argue that disgorgement is not forfeiture and therefore the whistleblower is ineligible? It's possible. And that's where I feel like that's where the meat on the bone, that's where the rubber's going to hit the road. And these are the questions, right? Anytime you have that level of ambiguity, it it makes it less likely a whistleblower is going to come forward. So I think that's the hard part. And so what's going to happen is this is a 3-year pilot program and DOJ during these 3 years, starting August 1st, is going to be accepting comments from all parties. And I think these will be the sorts of things that we intend to be having very robust conversations with them about.
And that really leads to the next topic I wanted to explore with you, because you mentioned a little bit earlier that you and others consulted with FinCEN to get them to make an adaptation. And the DOJ seems to indicated that this is a pilot program subject to change when appropriate. So do you, first of all, do you believe the DOJ will at least entertain your remarks and listen to you? And then if need be, actually might make a change?
I think they will. I mean, they definitely said, and both Lisa Monaco and Nicole Argentieri's comments, they did say that the nature of this being a pilot program is very much that they're in learning mode. And they have spoken to a lot of stakeholders. So it's not just my firm. We work with a nonprofit called the Anti Fraud Coalition, which has brought together a lot of comments. So they have been talking to all the stakeholders, and I I don't see any reason why those lines of communication will not stay open. What I think is interesting about this program, why I applaud DOJ for coming forward with it, is that doing this as a 3-year pilot program, assumption, I assume that they are hoping that they will produce enough results, and I'm confident they will because I'm confident that you're going to see seeing lots of tips coming in. That if they can show enough success, then it can motivate Congress to give them even the authority to have even a more robust program. So I think that's very much their aim. And so if that's their aim, then they want to work with all the stakeholders to make sure that our concerns are addressed so it can be the most successful program. I mean, honestly, I just think there is nothing like jealousy and envy, right? It was the success of the False Claims Act that motivated the SEC to have its program. It's been the success of the SEC program that motivated FinCEN to have its program. I do feel like DOJ was feeling left out and saying, why aren't we adequately leveraging whistleblowers? They've been so empowering to enforcement efforts. Why aren't we using them as force multipliers? Because that's very much what they are. So I think they very much want to make sure that they get the mantle passed to them to have a program like this that goes on beyond 3 years and that maybe would be even more broadly expanded.
Could I maybe flip that to another way to say or ask, do you see a direct line from Chuck Grassley to Barney Frank to the pilot program?
I sure do. I sure do. It's interesting. In 1986, the False Claims Act was amended to, it was really kind of a more of a backwater program. It didn't have appropriate incentives for whistleblowers. And it was really starting as a bipartisan effort in 86 with Chuck Grassley that the False Claims Act took off. And then he pushed for very much for the creation of the IRS program because there'd been an exception under the False Claims Act, not allowing whistleblowers to bring information about tax fraud. So he got that program going. And then, as you're alluding to Barney Frank, very much with the consumer fraud protection and Dodd-Frank and Wall Street reform, we expanded it. And so it's just been an enormous growth industry, Tom. And I think one of the most exciting things that I have been able to witness is not just the expansion of these programs inside the United States, but I really believe you're hearing this here. My prediction is the United Kingdom this year will finally adopt a whistleblower incentive program. The stars are starting to align there because the Labour Party has regularly made this part of their platform and they're obviously in power. We're waiting to, the new head of the Serious Frauds Office has given full throated endorsement of it. And I think finally there seems to be a changing of the tides. There's a think tank in the UK called RUSI that's about to issue a report endorsing them too. It's definitely, I'm feeling that there's certainly a ripple effect going outward. And that will be exciting to see how these other countries use and adopt our programs and make them their own.
Mary, when we were visiting before we started the podcast, you mentioned an origin story. Did we cover that on my question about Chuck Grassley to Barney Frank to 2024?
We sure did. We sure did. To me, the origin story was that it's really remarkable that DOJ looked at its existing statutes and said, "I'm going to take this ability to pay confidential informants and I'm going to expand it into a full-blown program." They did it on their own initiative. They didn't have to be told by Congress that they had to put a program in place. So I give them strong credit for that. And I also just give them strong credit for being even-handed in terms of not wanting to undermine internal compliance programs by including things in place. While you don't have to report internally first, it certainly behooves you to because you can get a higher reward in the percentage if you had it reported internally first, and then really giving that 120-day timeline to encourage whistleblowers to get out ahead of the corporate compliance programs. I think it's a great thing. And again, I just keep thinking they didn't want to be left behind.
I'd like to end by perhaps exploring your perspective on what this might mean for corporate compliance programs and corporations. I see this really as a two edged knife. Number one, putting a lot more pressure on internal whistleblower programs, speak up cultures, but that's just the start. Then it's triage and it's investigation and it's getting it to the right people to make the decision to self disclose or not. And then, but also an opportunity for compliance professionals to say, we need more resources at the start of this process. And we need to be able to get the information from our own employees and essentially crowdsource our own information about our own corporation internally so that we can make ourselves better. And oh, by the way, if the DOJ comes knocking, we can show them we have done this and perhaps get a full declination. Do you have any thoughts, really, one way or the other, from your perspective as a whistleblower representing attorney about what this might mean for a compliance function inside of a corporation?
Yeah, I mean, this to me is the most exciting component and aspect of this program is the pressure that it puts on corporations who heretofore I think could take a much more lax approach to investigating a whistleblower tip, right? My view is that it frequently was that these kinds of tips were swept under the carpet. And now that there's been created this race against the clock, can you get there as a corporate compliance program within the 120 days? That really makes you cannot just ignore reports. And I think one of the things going to be a challenge is that legal and compliance are going to have to work in tandem, right? Because not everybody reports internally inside a corporation through a hotline. Some people just report to their managers. So I think there's going to need to be a real emphasis on making sure any sort of whistleblower report is vetted and brought to the surface as quickly as possible so it can be investigated. And even if your internal investigation says that you don't think necessarily that there's a problem, I still think it's going to behoove certain companies to come forward nonetheless and just to be able to show, like, hey, we're investigating this and we came to the conclusion there's nothing here, but we know that there's a whistleblower who thinks otherwise. So I think even in the instance where I think people would have closed the books saying, okay, I've looked at the report and I don't see there being a there, depending on sort of the level of where it sits, you may see more companies choosing to come forward. So to me, this is music to my ears because it means that people that I greatly respect, which is the compliance industry, the compliance officers are often made to be compliant officers, right? They want them to just, they're seen as a cost center and they're people who are they're not dissimilar to whistleblowers. They're telling us what we can't do. I think finally they're going to be seen as a really vital role and that they're going to need to be given the resources to vet and look at and investigate, pursue these whistleblower complaints in a way that maybe they hadn't before.
Mary, I think we're going to have the chance to visit about this topic down the road. And frankly, I can't wait to see how it goes for you guys.
It's exciting for us. So thank you so much for letting me come on and talk about it. The last thing I did want to say, Tom, is that there is an exception in the program where to be eligible as a whistleblower, you have to bring original information. And there's a limitation on people in the compliance and internal audit function. So just like the SEC program, where the FinCEN program has no limitation, internal auditors, compliance officers can bring tips under the FinCEN program. DOJ has taken a page out of the SEC's book, and they're basically saying that if you hold the role of compliance officer, internal audit function, you are not eligible to be a whistleblower under this program, except they do have an exception except if the information you're trying to disclose is necessary to prevent criminal conduct likely to lead to imminent physical, financial, patient, or national security harm. So I don't want to count out the compliance officer as whistleblower. You still can be a whistleblower just like you can be under the SEC program if you have to fit under one of those exceptions. I think that's an interesting piece in terms of this is again DOJ trying to walk the line of not undermining compliance, but at the same time making sure compliance function can still report in certain more extreme circumstances.
I'm certainly comfortable with that because in my world, any compliance violation, which would lead to an FCPA violation, would by definition be a criminal violation. whether the DOJ chooses to charge criminally or civilly. So I'm comfortable with that for compliance professionals and internal auditors.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me on, and I hope you're having a